At the beginning of this year, I had exposure to over 10 different crypto projects. And a lot of these projects I was investing in because they had a lot of hype surrounding them, and I knew that they do really well during the early phases of the crypto bull market. But now to me, it seems like we're entering the mid-cycle phase of the crypto bull market, and I've condensed my portfolio to just 5 high conviction plays. And the difference between the projects that I'm invested in now compared to at the beginning of the year are that not only do they have really strong use cases that are going to continue to drive their adoption over time, but they also have really strong economic incentives that are going to drive the investment performance of the token. And now in this video, I'm going to be talking about one of those projects that I have a really high level of conviction in, and that's REN. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to cover what problem REN solves, how the team has went about solving that problem, how REN stacks up against its competitors, and then we're going to wrap it up by taking a look at the economic incentives that are going to drive the investment performance of this token. And we're going to talk about what needs to happen for REN to become the 10-bagger that I think it has the potential to become by the end of the year. So with that, let's jump right into it. Now, what initially got me really excited about REN was learning about the scale of the problem that REN is trying to solve. And the problem that REN is trying to solve is the interoperability of blockchains. Prior to protocols like REN or wrapped Bitcoin, users weren't able to send assets across different blockchains. So for example, if you had Bitcoin and you wanted to go use that Bitcoin on a decentralized application built on top of Ethereum, the only way for you to access that decentralized application was to sell your Bitcoin for Ethereum and then go use that app. But a lot of people don't want to sell their Bitcoin, so they never end up using that decentralized application, even though they might have been able to make a really efficient use out of that application using their Bitcoin. So essentially the problem that this creates is liquidity being trapped on a blockchain when it could otherwise be more efficiently put to use on another blockchain. And a specific area that I think REN is going to be the most important for the coming years is in its applications for decentralized finance. Right now we're seeing an explosion in the number of decentralized finance apps being built on top of different layer 1 blockchains. For example, Polkadot, Ethereum, Binance Smart Chain, Tezos, and Solana are all developing their own decentralized finance solutions on top of their layer 1 blockchains. And there can be a lot of yield farming opportunities within these assets or arbitrage opportunities that can only be taken advantage of if you have the ability to move assets across different blockchains. So for example, if somebody is earning yield on their Bitcoin in the Polkadot ecosystem and they realize that they can be earning more yield in Ethereum, then being able to seamlessly shift their Bitcoin from Polkadot to Ethereum is a massive advantage. So in essence, the problem that REN is solving is an efficiency problem that once it's solved is going to allow for the free flow of liquidity across different blockchains. But even further than that, it's going to make the entire blockchain ecosystem as a whole more efficient and also make it more accessible to everyday users. So the scale of this problem is absolutely massive and is what got me interested to learning more about REN and where it's going to go in the future. Alright, so now let's take a look at how REN allows for the interoperability of blockchains. Now, REN does this by using a commonly used model called the Tokenized representation model. And in this model, essentially REN acts as a custodian for specific assets, and after REN takes custody of an asset, they then issue a one-to-one pegged token representing ownership of that asset on a destination blockchain. So let's use an example of somebody who wants to use Bitcoin on the Ethereum network. The user would initiate a transaction with REN using RENbridge. After interacting with RENbridge and putting in their order details, the user would then deposit that Bitcoin in a Bitcoin wallet address, which would be custodied by the REN protocol. And then the REN protocol would issue an ERC20 token, which would be called WBTC, which represents a one-to-one pegged ownership of that custodied asset on the Ethereum blockchain. The user would then be able to use that tokenized representation of Bitcoin on applications built on the Ethereum network. And that's an example of a transaction called a lock and mint transaction. There's 2 other types of transactions that are permissible under the REN protocol. The second type of transaction is called a burn and release. And essentially this is just the opposite of a lock and mint. The user says, hey, I want my Bitcoin back. Then the REN protocol would take that ERC20 token representing ownership of Bitcoin. They'd burn that token and release back the original assets to the owner. And the third type of transaction that you can do on the REN protocol is called a burn and mint. And the burn and mint transaction would be like moving Bitcoin from an Ethereum address over to a Polkadot address. And essentially the way that this transaction would work is that the REN protocol would take in that ERC20 token and burn it and then issue a token on the Polkadot network that represents the same ownership after fees as was transferred from the Ethereum blockchain. Now, as of today, REN is able to custody Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Filecoin, Luna, Dogecoin, and Zcash, and supports the ability to create a tokenized representation of any of those assets on Ethereum or Binance Smart Chain. But coming up in the next year is going to be an integration with Solana, Avalanche, and Polkadot. So the ecosystem where you're going to be able to use RenBridge is growing and growing at a pretty rapid pace, as RenBridge was introduced less than a year ago. Now REN does have some competitors, for example WBTC, IMBTC, TBTC, and PBTC. But all of these other options have flaws in their own ways that REN has set out to solve. And the reason why I think that REN is the best option out of all of these is the fact that REN is decentralized, it's permissionless, and it also has designed a clever system to ensure that it can always maintain a one-to-one peg regardless of market conditions. And we're going to get into exactly how they're able to do that. So the REN network is powered by a large number of independent operators called Darknodes. In order to run a Darknode, you have to bond 100,000 REN tokens to your Darknode as a commitment to good behavior. And the reason why it represents a commitment to good behavior is because if a Darknode ever acts maliciously by stealing or losing a user's assets, then the REN protocol slashes that Darknode's bonds and uses their REN tokens in order to buy back the lost or stolen assets. Now, in order to process transactions, Darknodes are arranged into large groups called shards. And in order to process a transaction, there has to be 33% or greater consensus among the Darknodes within a given shard. Now, in order to reduce the probability that somebody would be able to corrupt a shard, Darknodes are randomly shuffled to form new shards every single day. So that means that for somebody to randomly be assigned 33% of a Darknode, they'd have to own a very significant portion of all of the Darknodes on the network. But on top of that, the REN protocol has also designed a clever system to ensure that it will always be able to restore a one-to-one peg, even if a malicious attack is successful on the network. And the way that it does this is by ensuring that the total value locked within a given shard is less than the amount of REN that is bonded to all the Darknodes that are custodying the assets within that shard. So for example, if there was an attack on the REN network and somebody was able to steal a lot of the assets within a shard, then the REN protocol would use the REN that was bonded to those malicious Darknodes in order to repurchase the stolen assets and return to that one-to-one peg. Now the REN network targets to have a bonded value that's 3 times greater than the total value locked within any given shard. And that is a threshold at which point it becomes unprofitable to try to steal from the REN network. However, it is possible that the total value locked is going to be below that threshold, but even if that's the case, the total value locked just has to be lower than the amount of REN that is bonded within a shard to be able to regain that one-to-one peg. So in this way, the REN protocol is able to always maintain that one-to-one peg without requiring a centralized authority to custody the assets. And this is one of the great advantages of using REN over something like wrapped Bitcoin, because wrapped Bitcoin has a centralized custodian and also requires KYC, whereas anybody can use the REN protocol and there is no centralized custodian, reducing the risk factor of having a central point of failure. Now, up to this point, it probably sounds like being a Darknode isn't a very good gig. But Darknodes are rewarded for taking on the risk of custodying these assets by being paid a fee for every transaction they process. And these fees are distributed across all of the Darknodes on the network. So this is going to lead us into the investment thesis portion of this video. Now that I've described how the REN protocol works and why I think that it's better than any of the current competitors out there, let's jump into the economic incentives that are going to make REN a great long-term investment. So my investment thesis is centered around the fact that I think that REN tokens are going to be worth the amount of rewards that are earned by the Darknodes on the network. Now, as it stands today, Darknodes are rewarded with 0.25% of a transaction for minting on the Ethereum network and 0.1% the value of a transaction for burning on the Ethereum network. And similarly, they're paid 0.1% for both minting and burning transactions on Binance Smart Chain. Now, the idea is that as more value is locked within the REN protocol and as more transactions are processed by the Darknodes on the network, then the fees generated by Darknodes on the network will also increase, and this is going to then attract more Darknodes to the network. Currently, there are 1,775 Darknodes registered, which means that around 17.75% of all the REN tokens that exist are bonded to Darknodes. I think that this number is going to continue to increase as more fees are generated on the network and as more value is locked on the network. Over the last 28-day period, Darknodes earned about $1.2 million in rewards. Now, just doing some quick back-of-the-envelope calculations, if they were able to earn $1.2 million every 28 days for the next 365 days, they'd be earning around $15.6 million. And given that there's around $200 million worth of REN bonded to Darknodes today, that comes out to an annualized yield of around 8%. Now, an 8% yield is pretty solid for a network that is expected to grow at a pretty rapid pace. And that 8% yield is also not taking into account any future growth. And essentially, there's 3 areas that I think are going to be keys for growth for the REN network. The first is going to be adding the interoperability with different layer 1 blockchains like Solana, Polkadot, and Avalanche. And actually what was really cool was to see that the REN team joined forces with Alameda Research. Now the team at REN already consisted of a bunch of gigabrains who had developed projects like KeeperDAO, and now they also joined forces with a team of even more gigabrains at Alameda Research who are developing a lot of cool things with FTX and Serum and Solana. So I think that this partnership is going to be really positive for REN in the future. And you can also be sure in the competence of the teams at Alameda Research and at REN that are going to be continuing to ensure its success in the future. So back to the interoperability with other blockchains. As REN is able to interoperate with other layer 1s, it's only going to bring more value locked onto that blockchain, as more people are going to be looking for ways to move their assets around from different blockchains. The second source of growth that I see for REN is growth in the value of the assets that are locked on the network. Because the revenue that is generated by the Darknodes is based on a percentage of the transaction value that is burned or minted by the network, if the tokens being custodied by the REN network today are to double in value before they're to be burned, then that right there represents a twofold increase in the revenues that are going to be generated by the network without having to custody any new assets than the ones that are on there today. For example, right now there's around $851 million worth of Bitcoin locked within the REN protocol. If Bitcoin were to double in price, then that means that the fees that the Darknodes are going to generate for people burning their tokenized representation of that Bitcoin is going to also increase by 2x. So that's a second source of growth for the REN protocol, and it's a really interesting one because you're essentially getting indirect exposure to all of the assets that are being locked within the REN protocol. Now the third source of growth is pretty much just going to come from the risk appetite of the Darknodes. If the Darknodes decide that a 5% yield is good enough, then people are going to be able to drive the price of Darknodes up. Or even further than that, maybe people decide that a 2% yield is worth the risk of operating a Darknode. In that case, it's just going to create upward repricing pressure on the price of REN, and as more people try to bond their REN to a Darknode, the price of REN is also going to go up. So those are the three sources of growth that I think are going to be contributing to the monumental run that I'm predicting for this year. And obviously, I don't know if it's actually going to play out, but I'm very hopeful that all these things are going to line up to create a super bullish environment for the pricing of REN. Now, what needs to happen for REN to become the 10-bagger that I think it can be this year is that, one, the value of the assets that are locked within the REN ecosystem need to go up in value. And since the majority of the assets locked are Bitcoin, that just means that Bitcoin needs to double or triple this year. And right there, that's going to be a 2 to 3x in the value of the REN, since as we said, you're getting indirect exposure to the value of the assets locked by owning REN tokens. The second thing that we need to see happen is we need to see more assets locked within REN. And we already saw a really dramatic increase in the last few months. So I think that this trend is likely going to continue as we start to see REN offer the interoperability within other layer 1 blockchains. So with that information in mind, I'm going to put a tentative price target out there. Now I was able to buy REN at around $1, and I'm hoping that REN's going to be able to go up to 10 and potentially even higher than that. But that's the tentative price target that I have for REN today. Now, right before I wrap up, there's a few things that I need to mention that you should be aware of if you're going to be investing in REN. The first is that it's still in its sub-zero phase of development. What this pretty much means is that it's still in its beta phase. And technically right now, the network is not decentralized. There's only one shard operating on the network, and that's because the core development team wants to retain ownership and control of the network right now, just to ensure that nothing goes wrong before it slowly becomes decentralized through phase 0. Now, when phase 0 comes out, that's when the REN protocol is going to start to become slowly decentralized until it reaches phase 1, at which point the protocol is going to be completely decentralized, and everything that happens on the network is going to be determined by REN token holders and by nodes on the network. And the second thing that I want to note is that we are still in the embryonic phase of this industry's life cycle, which means that there's probably going to be a lot of competition coming out and trying to steal market share from REN, and somebody could definitely come out with a better product than REN that steals a bunch of market share away and just kills their opportunities for growth. So personally, I'm not putting all my eggs in one basket, and I have around 3% of my portfolio allocated to REN. And clearly, I'm not a financial advisor, so you shouldn't be taking any of what I'm saying here as financial advice. This is just the research that I've been doing over the last couple of weeks, and I thought it'd be good to share with all of you so that maybe you can also benefit from the potential upside that we're going to see in REN. So that does it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed and found this video valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like and subscribe button because it really helps this channel out and lets me know that I need to keep doing more videos like this one. So thanks for sticking until the end, and I look forward to seeing you all in my next video.